going to record. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Victoria Ahrens.
Thank you, Avi. Welcome, everybody. I truly wish I could be there. It's such a pleasure just even to be here remotely. And I'm hoping next year I will actually be there on site with all the rest of you. But welcome to everybody. Welcome, Hanna. And I just will make a few remarks about the book and why we selected it. At the heart of Hanna Halperin's beautifully crafted novel, Something Wild, is the singular weight of family. And what could be more Jewish than that? The defining legacy that one bears. As Halperin writes, how when you're born into a family, you're born into this very specific kind of sadness. It's part of you before you even enter the world. So much history. And it's a history, a family history that extends transgenerationally and that links the generations in an ongoing narrative. At the end of the novel, Nessa, one of the central characters, as Halperin writes, thinks about all the people carrying around things they have no idea they're carrying around. She wonders what's inside her, all the things she doesn't know about. Something Wild is a novel of our times. Halperin's portrait of a single family opens itself up to the vulnerabilities and violence of our age. It's a narrative of fracture and loss, desperation and modes of concealment, of brutality mistaken for love. But this is also a novel of resilience, of reinvention, and of resistance. And in this way, Something Wild is a very Jewish novel, a portrayal of ordinary people whose lives are dismantled by unanticipated events over which they have no control. In the long tradition of Jewish literature, both secular and scriptural, Halperin sensitively exposes the drama of families, the betrayals, treacheries, deceptions, and secrets that tear families apart, but also the deep connections and loyalties and love that hold families together. Told through the intersection and juxtaposition of different perspectives, this is a novel about memory, about generations unfolding, about the past and the future, and finally, about the stories we tell ourselves and others. Congratulations, Hanna. It was just a pleasure to read this novel.
Thank you, Vicki. I'm going to turn the screen over now to Josh.
Thanks, Vicki. It's always such a pleasure to do this judging work with you, and thanks everyone for being here, the Waltman family. I'll just add a little bit to what Vicki said to say a little bit about what struck me and touched me so much about this book. It's a book about. It's important to say, and I think it's important to say, especially for anyone who hasn't read it, it's a book that's about domestic violence, and it's very painful to read in many ways. Because it's very honest and very, forthright in depicting, a part of our culture and society that is brutal and horrifying. I think that when I started to read this novel and got a sense of what it was about, I would have not been surprised if we didn't learn a lot about the sort of ethnic backgrounds or identities of the family at the center of Nessa and Tanya and their mother and their father. Because I think when you're talking about violence, where people come from doesn't often matter that much, right? Like when a woman is being abused, the question we ask is not like, where's her family from, right? Or like, what background is she from? What you want to do is get that person protection, and you want to help that person. But what the novel does, and it really fascinates me, is gives us a lot of texture and a lot of attention to the role that Jewishness plays in Nessa and Tanya's lives and how it might inform the way that gender they experience their gender, they experience sexuality, and they experience their place in the world. It's a novel that, because it's so tightly plotted and does such effective things in moving through its story, I don't want to, like usually with a literary novel, like spoilers aren't really a problem, but I really don't want to give anything away about the plot of this novel, so I'm going to try not to. But what I think is really important to say about Jewishness is that part of this family story, right, is that the two sisters at the center of the book, their dad leaves their mom when they're young kids. And that's hard on their family in a lot of ways, but part of one of the things that happens to them is they lose their connection to Judaism and to Jewishness because he was Jewish and their mom was not. And so once he's gone, keeping Jewish traditions or participating in that doesn't seem relevant to them. And that's, you know, obviously like a powerful loss in their lives, but it's played off against and connected to that as an adult, one of the characters, Tanya, has met her husband, was raised in a modern Orthodox family, and represents, I think, a kind of maybe close to a model of what a young woman might look for in a husband. Someone caring, seems feminist, seems to want a family and want to be together. And I think that part of what the novel is doing in showing these different narratives and connecting the sister stories with their mother's story is, I think, helping us to see the way in which our culture is still telling young women that if they want safety, if they want economic security, they have to please a man. And I think that's a facet of the world we live in that we have to really come to terms with and think about the ways in which our culture perpetuates that, its perniciousness, and how deeply problematic it is. And I think one of the things that the novel does is point us in that direction, at the same time as it gives us a sense of what the ways out of that might be, or how to maybe resist that. I think the last thing I'll say, and what I like to try to do when I think about a Wallant novel, is think back in literary history and see like where I can place a book, or what this reminds me of, or where I see it fitting. And in many ways, it feels like a novel so much of our time. I think that when you go back to feminist fiction of the 1970s, lots of it written by like incredible Jewish women writers, you see attention to things like assault and abuse. But I think that even there, and even with the politics of those works, you don't feel quite as, I don't think you feel quite as affected by the representation of those sort of acts of violence as you do here. But I'll say, like, I'll give you just another strange way that this novel settled on me. So I teach an Introduction to Jewish Studies class at Wellesley. And a few weeks ago, not that long ago, I invited a Bible scholar who's a colleague of mine there to come in and talk to the students in my class about the Torah and the creation story in Genesis. And one of the things he wanted my students to see was a Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, that predates Genesis, and that you can, when you read it and you read Genesis, you see how Genesis is patterned on this Babylonian creation myth to some degree. And what's incredible is that that story about the creation of the world is told as the destruction and the violence against a woman by a male god, like a male god sort of ripping apart the body of a female goddess to create the world. And it's like very striking and strange to think that going back through all the stories that humanity has told, that we have for thousands of years, there are these stories of violence against women and the desire of men to sort of effect violence against women. And I think that we're at a moment in our culture, hopefully, where we can like think in new ways about gender, think in new ways about like what it means to represent gender and to represent sexuality, and how we can create like a world in which no one has to fear or expect to be the subject of violence. And I think this book, in its own very, very small way, is a part of making that happen. And it's a truly important and wonderful book, and I'm glad to be able to give it a prize. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Vicky. I think you can tell that for the judges this year, once we read Hannah's novel, it became very clear that this was this year's winner. And sometimes that just happens, right? There could be a lengthy process of reading books, and then you read one and say, this is it, especially in the ways that it stays with you for a very, very long time. So I want to invite Marjorie and Lawrence to come up for the Walton family's formal presentation of this year's Edward Lewis Wallant Award. Hanna Halperin is a graduate of the MFA program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her stories have been published in the Kenyon Review, N+1, New Ohio Review, Joyland, and others. She teaches fiction workshops at Grub Street in Boston and works as a domestic violence counselor. Her debut novel, Something Wild, was a finalist for the 2021 National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction, and it is the recipient of the 2021 Edward Lewis Wallant Award for Jewish American fiction. Congratulations, Hanna.
Congratulations.
So this is the point in the ceremony where we've talked a lot about your book and we've talked a lot about you, and now it's your chance to tell us a little bit about yourself and about the book. So what we're going to do is we're going to give Hanna a chance to speak, and then we'll have a Q&A, which I know the judges, we all have questions we want to ask, but I also want to encourage questions from the audience, and we're going to try to also take questions from the Zoom. So everybody who's on the Zoom, you've been muted for now. You can type in questions into the chat, but we might also be able to unmute when we get to that part of the program. So Hanna Halperin.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you for those incredibly kind words. I can't tell you how much this means to me. Many of the authors who have received the Edward Lewis Wallant Award before me are authors who I have been reading for years, and who have written books that have been on my bookshelves and my family's bookshelves since I was a kid. And this is a huge honor and so special to me. I've been thinking a lot about what makes a book Jewish or Jewish American, and if my book is Jewish. When I moved to Madison, Wisconsin in 2014 for my MFA in fiction writing, I became distinctly aware of my Jewishness in a new way. There weren't many Jews in Wisconsin. I thought about my family, how I'd grown up, my writing, as if I was looking down at myself from above. This was also the first time I read Goodbye Columbus by Philip Roth. I remember reading a description of cut up fruit salad in the fridge and feeling so homesick and comforted at the same time. There was something so Jewish about that fruit salad, or at least Jewish in the way that I was familiar with. One of the first stories I wrote in Wisconsin was about a mother and a daughter. My professor, Judith Mitchell, who is also Jewish, said to me about the story, "I know these people, I recognize them." This meant so much to me. She was one of the first people who helped me understand that I was writing Jewish characters, even though Judaism often didn't come up explicitly in my stories. When I read her novel, A Reunion of Ghosts, I too recognized the women in her novel. I asked her if I could do an independent study with her that semester where we read literature written by Jewish authors. I was interested to know how Jewish writers wrote their Jewish characters and how those characters thought about being Jewish, whether Judaism was at the forefront of their fiction or woven into the background. We read Nathan Englander, Cynthia Ozick, Philip Roth, Julie Oranger, some of whom are past recipients of the Edward Lewis Wallant Award, which is really amazing to me. For me, Judaism is a feeling of home. In Something Wild, home is not always safe or comfortable, but it's familiar. The book opens when home becomes something terrifying to sisters Tanya and Nessa Bloom. The more you read, the more you understand that home has been scary for them for a long time, most of their lives. Though when scary is your norm or your constant, it's hard to name it or comprehend it as scary. It made sense to me that both sisters are struggling to redefine home, where it is and who it is with. Tanya, the younger sister, holds on to Judaism, remembering the brief moments and brief feelings of calmness and joy that she associates with it and with her childhood. She forms new associations with Judaism too, with her husband Eitan and her unborn baby, and with her stepmother Simone, who she finds more acceptable and more tolerable than her own messy family. Nessa seems to bury Judaism, though she brings up the idea of God and the idea of being punished a lot. I didn't make these decisions consciously while I was writing, for one sister to embrace Judaism and for the other to reject it. And really, it's not what the book is about. I think the book is very much about the end of childhood for the Bloom sisters and the violence that all three Bloom women face: Nessa, Tanya, and most urgently, their mother, Lorraine. One thing I've learned during my work as a domestic violence counselor is that domestic violence does not discriminate. It happens in every community, in every type of family, every religion, race, socioeconomic background. Who these women are and the way they identify religiously and culturally was an important piece of their lives. But while I was writing, I was most focused on their relationships with each other. In this particular moment in their lives, how do they show up for one another? It was during my work as a counselor that I became interested in the ways that trauma and violence is passed down in families. While I was writing the first draft, I was working at a domestic violence and rape crisis counseling center on Martha's Vineyard. The year-round population on the island is very small, and I got to know that community really well. What I saw time and time again was that often women showing up for other women. More often than not, it was mothers showing up for their daughters, or sometimes daughters showing up for their mothers. I saw this in courtrooms and hospitals and police stations, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during the day. Though it was evident how much these mothers and daughters loved one another. Often we show up for the people that we love. Many times there was anger, frustration there too. And these interactions could be tense and sometimes explosive. I think it's common to get angry at someone who is in an abusive relationship, especially when they don't leave the relationship. On average, it takes someone 7 times to leave an abusive relationship before they leave for good. It's part of why telling family or friends that you're in an abusive relationship can be so difficult and risky. You can usually guess what a family member or friend might say or how they might react to hearing that you're in an abusive situation. Sometimes you'll be blamed or shamed or seen as weak or told what to do, leave, and how and when to do it immediately. Leaving an abusive relationship is not simple or easy, and it's also very dangerous. These fraught moments and the closeness and that switching back and forth between love and protectiveness and anger felt really urgent to me, and I wanted to write about it. I thought that I would read a very short excerpt of the book. That's and just to give you a little bit of context, this is when, so sisters Nessa and Tanya, as adults, they go home to help their mom clean out their childhood house, and that's when they discover that their mom is in an abusive relationship with their stepfather, and the sisters have very different reactions to finding this out. And they're basically trying to convince their mother to get a restraining order. And that weekend, the three of them go to a bed and breakfast in Vermont and are kind of escaping the situation for that weekend, trying to figure out what to do. And this is when the two sisters and their mother are out to dinner and in Vermont. And this chapter is from the point of view of Nessa, the older daughter. They're all adults by this time. Okay. The restaurant is on Main Street, nestled between Bennington Pizza House and a clothing shop. The storefront's painted green with big windows looking into the dimly lit pub, all wood and brick. Inside, there's dozens of empty tables and a bar. They're greeted by the hostess and led to a table by the window. Other than the employees, they're the only people there. A waiter comes by with the menus, a teenage boy, his face and neck studded with infected acne. "Welcome to Madison Brewing Company," he says, pouring them water and avoiding eye contact. Quietly, they look through the menus. After a minute, Tanya puts hers down. "I can't eat any of this." "Why not?" Lorraine asks. "Everything is fried or drenched in cheese," she says. "It's fine. I'll just get something from the supermarket after you guys are done." Nessa's jaw tightens, agitated. She doesn't know why her sister always feels the need to put them down, to equate the oil, the cheese with something about them. Nessa no longer eats the way she did as a child. Not that the hunger has gone away, but she's figured out other ways to curb it. She's not as thin as Tanya, who pays $70 a month so that she can run herself ragged on a battered New York Sports Club treadmill every morning. But Nessa likes her body. Not every day and not in every mirror, but overall. It's usually when she's next to Tanya that she's tempted to stuff herself again. "Do you want to go somewhere else?" Lorraine asked Tanya. "Did you hear his list of restaurants?" "What about the fish place?" Tanya rolls her eyes. "Well, if there's nothing you can eat here, it doesn't make sense to stay," Lorraine says. "You must be hungry. What if you got the eggplant dish?" "It's fried," Tanya says. "It's fine. I'm not even that hungry." "Oil isn't going to kill you, Tanya," Nessa says. Tanya lets out a short laugh. "Actually, that's exactly what it will do." "Well, don't ruin it for us," Nessa says. Tanya holds up her hands. "I'll shut up." The waiter returns. "Are you ready to order?" he asks. And when no one says anything, Nessa nods. "Go ahead, Mom." Lorraine squints at the backside of the menu. "I'm wondering," she says, pointing, "if it's possible to get the eggplant dish, but without frying the eggplant." Like just a plain eggplant?" "Well, a little oil's okay," she says. "Just, not deep fried." He scratches at his pad. "Okay, I'll ask them." Then he turns to Tanya, and Nessa sees the way her sister's prettiness and forthright gaze catch him off guard. "What would you like, miss?" he stammers. Under the violent red of his acne, his cheeks burn even brighter. Tanya smiles coolly. "I'm set with water, thanks." "Oh, okay." He begins to write it down before remembering they already have water glasses in front of them. He turns to Nessa next, visibly relieved, and his face resumes its normal color. "And you?" he asks. Hurt tugs at Nessa's chest, followed swiftly by humiliation. How pathetic she is to feel rejected by a 15-year-old waiter. "I'll have the pulled pork sandwich," Nessa says, just to piss off Tanya, and an appetizer of truffle fries for the table. A tense minute passes after the server leaves. Then Tanya speaks. "So we should talk about Monday." Lorraine sighs. "I guess we should." "I don't see any reason why you won't get the restraining order if you tell the judge about the strangulation," Tanya says. "Jesse, I'm assuming, will show up to the hearing, and he'll have a chance to speak, but I'm not really worried about that. But Mom, I do think you have to mention the physical abuse, and that you have documentation that you went to the hospital. I know it's hard to talk about, but the judge needs to know the full story, and that's a crucial part of the story." "Tanya," Nessa says, "why don't you let Mom decide what is crucial to the story? It is her story, after all." "Are you pissed at me for some reason?" Tanya says, turning to Nessa, "for not ordering something?" "I just think you're being a little condescending." "Girls, come on." Lorraine leans back in her chair. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so I know that hopefully the sound will come through better now. I know some people were having technical issues. Vicky, can you hear us okay? I'm gonna add you here.
Yes, it's much clearer now.
Okay, great. So we're gonna do a little bit of Q&A with the judges, if that's okay with you, Hannah, and then we'll open it up for discussion, and people can type in questions into the chat as well. So I'll start, but Josh and Vicky, feel free to jump in when you want. So let's pick up exactly with sort of the scene that you, something that you wrote in the scene that you just read, which is they're in the diner, or the restaurant, Madison Brewery in Vermont, and they're having a disagreement about how Lorraine, the mother, is going to tell her story to the judge, right? And so I think the first question that I want to ask you is, you do something very interesting in the novel, which is that you take multiple perspectives for your characters. So can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to do that, or was it a process that evolved over time? Who was going to tell this story, or did you decide from the beginning you were going to try to tell it from multiple perspectives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When I started writing this novel, it was almost completely from Nessa's point of view when I wrote the first draft. And then I think almost as an exercise for myself, I started writing little vignettes from Tanya's point of view. And that was interesting for me to go into Tanya's point of view. But it was very uneven. It was like, 70% Nessa and 30%, I don't know what the numbers were. And Lorraine's story actually evolved much later for me in the writing process, and her chapters came later. And I mean, if you read the book, it's not, the pages aren't even, and I struggled a lot with that. I was like, should it be, like 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, but I was really struggling, like, whose story is this? Like, is it Nessa's story? Is it the sister's story? And by the end of the editing process, I was actually kind of worried that I hadn't told enough of Lorraine's story. And then I came to the conclusion that, this was really the sister's story, and it would have ended up being, maybe a different book if I had gone too much more into I felt it was important to have Lorraine's voice in there, really important. But if I had gone too much into her voice, it would have, turned into a pretty different book. And ultimately, I was interested in Nessa and Tanya, it being Nessa and Tanya's book primarily.
Josh, Vicky, I don't know if you want to, should pick up your voices based on her. Vicky, do you want to jump in? Go ahead, Vicky.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that question, Avi, because I wanted Hannah to talk a little bit more about point of view. I mean, I thought it was so effectively done. And it seems to me that the different perspectives really get at these different attempts to make sense of what's happening, but also how to react. And there are points in here where, the chapters are very different in terms of perspective, but there are also some chapters, and I really thought the one you read from is an example of this, where the points of view collide, where you get more than one controlling point of view. And I guess also what I wanted to say is I thought it was very, very appropriate and telling that Lorraine's point of view is in some ways muted, because she, of course, is silenced. She's silenced by the violence done to her. And I thought that you mirrored that, or reflected that, or represented that in part by having these other points of view be at times, most dominant.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think sort of like adding on to what you just said is, you know, when someone does disclose to you that they're in an abusive relationship, oftentimes you're only hearing a fraction of what's actually gone on. And you might only be hearing, it's rare that you're hearing sort of the worst of it. And you know, Nessa and Tanya at the beginning of the novel sort of witness some of the violence and are maybe not aware that they're kind of witnessing like kind of the tip of the iceberg. And, you know, sort of the more you read on, you do, you know, more is revealed, but even as the reader, you only know so much because you only hear so much from her. So.
Well, and also, oh, I'm sorry, Josh. I just wanted to follow up with that. Also, I thought the shifting points of view, because for the family, this is not just the mother's story. This becomes everybody's story. They're all pulled into it and it affects them in different ways and some similar ways. But these are characters, I have to tell you, we become invested in. We care about these characters. And that's really, I think, one of the markers of a really finely crafted novel.
The question I want to ask you is,
Josh, just speak up.
yeah, sorry, I will. So one of the challenges at this moment teaching literature, thinking about literature, is that there's a lot of challenges. It's a very strange time where state governments are challenging the teaching of certain kinds of books, where certain kinds of students don't want to read certain kinds of books. And a book like yours that is really sort of honest about depicting very difficult parts of life. I guess the question I want to ask you about it is, because you've worked with people in very difficult situations and probably heard from some readers who've responded to your book, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why, like, obviously you're not representing this violence to exploit it or just for the sake of entertainment. And I'd love to hear you talk about, you know, what effect can reading work like this have for people out there in the world, or what effect do you maybe hope it will have, or have you seen it have? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think how to answer that. I think while I was writing this novel, I was not thinking about any of those questions. And while I was writing this novel, I wasn't thinking that I was writing a book about domestic violence. Like, it was very much like, this is a book about these two sisters and their mother and the relationships between them. And I was like, I was like so seeped in my job. Like, I was thinking about that all the time. And I was, and I think like once I was seeing that and thinking about it, like I was seeing it a lot, and I wasn't just seeing it at work. I was seeing it just in my life. And so it became sort of hard to turn it off. And like the way it sort of was, I think it was kind of like already in my fiction before I even started working as a domestic violence counselor, but then it became like more prominent, like when I was doing that work, just because I was sort of witnessing some more visceral details and trauma, and obviously everything in the book is fictionalized. But it like seeped into the writing in ways that was like, it would have felt dishonest to not have included just stuff that was like such a big part of my life, or, you know, and just like women's lives that, and men's lives too, everybody's lives. It feels like it's happening all the time. So I think I think a lot of people probably will read the book and like recognize a lot of stuff, sadly, but I don't know if that exists.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think that that's part of the success of the book is that people will see themselves, see parts of their experience in it. And I'm just thinking about, or maybe expressing it as a hope that for someone out there who's either figuring out what choices they want to make or trying to grapple with trauma in their family history, that seeing their experience in the book will be like really meaningful and will help them through that.
Yeah, that would mean the world to me.
So I want to ask a question, which you alluded to, and sorry, I have a way of trying to control the camera here. Okay. Which you alluded to in your remarks and Josh brought up, and we've talked about this a few times, which, so we have this criteria of this is an award for Jewish fiction, right? And you referenced in your remarks sort of where you see the Jewishness in your writing, or either consciously or subconsciously how it appears. And I want to ask about sort of in this novel, there's this very interesting dynamic which Josh alluded to also, right? Where Tanya, has her husband Eitan, or fiance Eitan, and their father is Jewish, and there is this interesting dynamic of like how Jewishness represents sort of possibilities of where their lives might have gone, but it's not a definite. In some cases, it's a path not taken. In other cases, it is a choice. Can you say a little bit more about how, if you didn't think about it consciously, or if you did think about it consciously, sort of why you wanted to kind of have these male figures, that the father and Eitan kind of be the Jewish influences in the novel, what that perhaps says.
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear your remarks about Eitan and sort of that in a way, like Tanya felt like to sort of get that happiness, she was still needing to please a man. And I think like I think probably because of the way, like, yeah, I think I again, like these, I don't know, those weren't necessarily things I was thinking about while I was writing, and then it's like afterwards, and like, where did those decisions come from? And so it's like hearing from people who have read the book, and that's something that, like, when I've done book groups, when the character of Eitan and Tanya, when their relationship comes up, it's sometimes it's a thing of like, oh well, they have the healthy relationship, and then sometimes it's a more critical thing of like, oh well Tanya's just taking like the path that she feels like she's supposed to take, and so like and I'm like, oh I don't know. So but I think Tanya is a character who is much more black and white in her thinking, and like I don't judge her for it. Like I don't judge her for it. Like, so I don't know if I can answer the question,
But, oh, sorry. If I could jump in a minute though, whether intentional or not, it does seem as if, when the father leaves, there's just this huge gap. There's this absence, there's this hole in the family dynamic, and in the daughter's, obviously the wife as well, but the daughter's sense of self and identity and place. And when he leaves, there's this absence of Judaism as well, or some kind of Jewishness. And so that lack is linked, I think, to loss. And so it makes perfect sense that at least one of the sisters would try to fill that gap, to return to that place. Some kind of
Yeah.
stability or sense of identity, or return to the past before the rupture.
I think I was very aware of Tanya's motivations, and that was part of her motivation and attraction. And it felt like, well, if it works for her, and it seems like it does, that's what I was thinking about, and what that means. Like, I don't exactly know.
There's that lovely line, like, there's a moment where she's thinking about it, and for her, it's, I'm not gonna do it perfectly, but like for her, that when she thinks of Judaism, it's like thinking of like a snow day when she was a kid.
Yeah.
It's like that feeling of a snow day. And what's fascinating about that to me is like, in the field of Jewish education, people would like be so thrilled if they could teach children to feel that way about Judaism, but she gets it from this very difficult and strange, attenuated relationship. And I think that there's something so true about that, that really resonates about the way desire, comes from loss and is driven by. I just think there's something about that that's so powerful.
Yeah. That it's actually, there's very few pages that I dog here in the book, but that part that you just referenced, Josh, where you write, Tanya has always associated Judaism with Jonathan, but she also associates Judaism with family, with togetherness, with childhood, something with her mother and her sister and herself. To her, the memory of Judaism is a tender one, like waking up on a snow day as a kid, outside bright and glittering, inside dark and warm with sleep. Yeah, it's beautiful to capture it that way. Yeah, Vicky's saying the sound is breaking up. Is it breaking up now, Vicky?
No, now it's fine. As soon as I typed that into the chat, it fixed.
So let me, I want to open up for questions. So I know if people in the audience want to ask questions, you can also type questions into the chat if you have questions for Hannah. Once in a lifetime opportunity. Q&A with a Wallant Award winner.
Avi, while people are thinking, can I ask a question? Hannah, this is sort of a tangential question, but not really, but I was just curious how you got involved in domestic violence counseling from, your creative writing program, and how did that happen?
It's an interesting question. I finished my MFA in Madison, and I'd always had this dream since I was a kid of moving to Martha's Vineyard year round. And so I was just like Googling jobs, and this job for a domestic violence counselor came up, and it seemed like something that I would find interesting. And I sort of applied knowing very little about it. And I got the job and moved there. And found that some parts of the job were obviously really difficult and like didn't come as naturally to me. And like some parts I think came really naturally to me. Like I found that I really liked it, and I'm still doing some of that work part-time now. And so I was doing that work and writing alongside it. And so it felt, in some ways it felt a bit random, in some ways it made sense for me at the time.
Questions? Yeah. If anybody on the Zoom, please feel free. Let us raise a hand. Can take questions. Yeah, go ahead, Lawrence. Yeah.
See, it's a great book to read. I really, and I, with the Wallant Award books, I can't help but think, what my mother would have thought about this book. So, and I'm still, I haven't really discussed it with my sister yet, but certainly there were a lot of Wallant Award books that have been very disturbing. So it's not like everything, all the books have kind of ended on a happy note. So that's more of a comment. And the other comment that I just wanted to make was that you were talking about the Tanya character. So, you know, there's something, I guess, in both of the sisters that's slightly self-destructive. I mean, what they do is when they're very young girls is like such an outrageous kind of thing. And, you know, I couldn't help but think, like, what kind of supervision were they getting, you know, from the mother? And, you know, so you get a sense that the mother was kind of, when the father left, the mother was pretty absentee, not really obviously supervising them. But again, this is just more of a comment about Tanya. And, you know, she has that moment where she's, you know, you think, oh my God, she's going to go off and do something really crazy, you know, with the guy. So I'm glad that you that she didn't do that. I was so relieved when, you know, when she gets in her mind that I have to go, you know, she looks at her, you know, right before it's going to go, you know, in a very bad direction. And she's going to really be destroying something, you know, good that she has in her life. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, me too.
That was a good decision.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad decisions made, but that was a good
Yeah.
decision. Yeah, she was an interesting character.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
How about this concept of the wild thing?
Mm.
Where did that come from? This sort of almost, you know, I don't know how to describe it, but this feeling that the girls get, which they can't exactly put their finger on, but is that something that, you know, you've been thinking about for a while, or it was something that came about with this novel?
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about for a while. It's something like I knew I had wanted to write about it somehow in fiction. And I had written about it like a while ago in sort of a separate piece, and then it seemed to like kind of this like sixth sense almost that I think I don't know if boys have it, but I think some girls probably have it, of danger and like why do girls have it? And for me it was really interesting, like, you know, these two sisters have it, and then it gets complicated obviously when, you know, this is the incident you referred to, when they're teenagers, where like they're kind of pitted against one another, which like girls often seem to be pitted against one another. And so that was, yeah, that was something that I, and this notion of wildness kind of like comes up again and again in the book. And I think like one thing that I think is interesting is like a lot of people I think will tend to think of abuse as wild. Like, you know, they'll describe abuse as, you know, like rage or being out of control or being, you know, like blindsided by emotion or like passion or something like that. But it's really sort of, you know, abuse is a choice. And so that's actually not like the wild thing is not the abuse in the book. It's to me, there's a lot of sort of, I actually got the title, the way I got the title was there's a line where Lorraine's loneliness is described as wild. And for me, like the book is a lot about like these three different women's, or sometimes girls' loneliness being wild. And And so I was more interested in sort of in that loneliness, in that wildness.
I'm curious, the sense of danger also suggests maybe a sense of power that the girls have. And I'm curious about your ideas about power.
Yeah, like I think this novel started as a short story that I wrote that was sort of about like kind of that those early teenage years, girlhood, and kind of about the sexuality of those years. And I think there's power in that, but it gets really it gets so exploited, and something so terrible happens. And I think, without obviously giving away any spoilers, like there's like, basically when the girls go home to help their mother, and they sort of see what the violence is happening to their mother, this traumatic incident from when they were girls ends up getting stirred up. And part of what the trauma of that incident is there was a sense of power or agency that the girls had involving that incident. But what happened in that, what happened then, they was violence, done to both of them in kind of different ways, but it really kind of, their relationship was changed after that. And so the book is a lot about that.
Oh, what the kids said.
Yeah.
I'll just repeat for people on the Zoom in case you couldn't hear. The question was, and again, we're playing with the spoiler issue, right? Which hopefully everybody will go out and be sort of driven to read the book. But the question was, did as the author creating this world, did you play with the idea of a different ending without giving away too much? But what's described as a more Hollywood ending where Lorraine makes a different choice that sort of reflects what her daughters might have wanted her to do.
I never considered writing a Hollywood ending, but I think I somehow knew that the ending that I wrote would shift something in the sisters' relationship that I was interested in exploring, which sounds really like mean and technical, but like that I was like, what would happen when that happened? And I'm trying to talk about it without like giving away anything, but I didn't know how writing was like, I don't like outline or plan, so I didn't know when I was writing, I didn't know how the writing was going to go, but I did know this one thing that was going to happen. And I didn't ever really consider that not happening, but I was kind of all thinking about it like through the lens of these two sisters.
Yes.
Thought about this. Do you think that what happened between the two girls, this may be not an okay question, like
We'll do our best. People are still going to want to read the book. Yeah.
what happened between the two girls as they were younger impacted the position they took with Lorraine, the diner?
So I'll just repeat the question, which came from Hannah's father. The question was, well, you can explain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the traumatic thing that happened with the two girls, did it impact like sort of the position they're playing, specifically the day in the diner, or just the whole?
Not like where they stood with Lorraine about how to manage what was happening.
Yeah, that That was the idea.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, like to me, it was like what was happening, like what was being stirred up and triggered for them, like that weekend was like they weren't talking about it, but like everything was sort of being through the, not everything, but a lot was sort of through what had happened, and there was, you know, there was anger and shame and all these feelings that they were feeling, you know, whether they were talking about their restraining order or whether they were talking about like, what are you ordering? Like it connected back in these ways, whether it was conscious or not. I think so.
I'll say one of the other really interesting things that you do in the novel, which I think is quite, it makes it so richly layered, is that we have these multi-generational relationships going on. So, you know, on the one hand, the daughters come home, and as a reader, you're thinking to yourself, like, how, you know, and you've talked about this, like the sort of secret nature of not talking about domestic violence, but they're still completely shocked by what their mother has been enduring, right? And like, how long is this going on? And so as a reader, you're wondering, like, sort of what is going on in the relationship, that they're off living their own lives in New York or in Western Mass. You know, she's at their home in Winter Street in Boston, and sort of, but they don't know, right? They're sort of removed. And then at the same time, you set it up very early on that Tanya discovers that she's pregnant, right? So there's this sort of layering of the mother-daughter or mother-child relationship, and the caretaking, but also children caring for a parent. And it's just a very interesting dynamic that I think makes it very, very richly layered.
Can I ask one more question? I'm trying to think of the timing of this and whether the timing is right, but were you already working on the novel and thinking about it when Me Too happened in 2017, or did it come after?
I had already been working on it.
I just wonder, like, how that enormous world sort of exploding sort of turn to focus on abuse and assault would have affected like your process of working on a project like this.
I don't remember it affecting it all that much. And I also remember like I was I was working on the novel, and then I was also working as a domestic violence counselor, and I think probably Me Too, like maybe people were maybe that caused some people to reach out who wouldn't have, but I also remember like it, in some ways it also still felt removed from like just the day-to-day of what work was at the domestic violence agency. So like it felt like, okay, that was just my memory of it. I also don't know if it was just like being on Martha's Vineyard sometimes feels like being like on a different country. But yeah, I don't remember.
No, but I think there's something to be said actually about how little domestic violence was a part of Me Too as a public phenomenon, right? That it was about different kinds of abuse, and all of which is like important and valuable. But when you think of actually like its blind spots or what it didn't address, I think one could say maybe domestic violence was a big part of that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems very related, like where there's, you know, sexual abuse, a lot of times there's domestic violence, like but yeah, it still somehow felt separate.
Yeah.
Could I go back a second? Could I say when I've been thinking about this, and you know, the question from the audience, and then what Avi said afterwards, this relation of between shame and concealment. And, you know, all the characters in the novel conceal. They all have secrets from each other, from themselves. And shame in many ways is a response to concealment, but concealment is also a response to shame. And the girls act that out as well as their mother. And that's one of the really disturbing generational or transgenerational things about how that's passed on, what's passed on, and the different ways in which it manifests itself. And I thought that was what that sort of chiastic exchange, you know, that exchange between shame and concealment, and how that can lock you into sort of separation from others, those who you're most intimate with, is so much at the center of the novel in really disturbing ways.
Yeah, it's interesting sort of like who in the novel people choose to reveal things to.
Right.
Sometimes it's to people that are really distant or not related at all, and sort of the people that you're closest to, you're kind of keeping the hardest things from. But yeah.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation and discussion. And for our first hybrid Wallant Award ceremony, I think it worked out okay. So please join me in congratulating this year's Wallant Award winner, Hanna Halperin. And if you haven't read the book, I think now you're really going to want to find out what happens in the end, because we did not successfully give it away. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us in person, and thank you everyone for joining us on the Zoom. And we look forward to seeing everybody again very soon. Congratulations
Thank you
again.
so much.